Good evening. On behalf of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, I'm Kim Hartman, and together with my husband, Alan, we are proud to welcome you tonight to this evening's event. This year, we are hosting a number of America's most distinguished writers and thinkers to tackle 4 modern questions about race, the culture wars, education, and anti-Semitism. We will welcome Hillary Clinton, Henry Kissinger, Anderson Cooper, Chris Wallace, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and so many more. We will hope you will join us. But tonight, we really have a great evening for you, and it is a critical conversation. Once in a generation, a trial can shift the trajectory of a nation. We are here tonight to preview this generation's trial. It begins in just 2.5 weeks on October 25th. The landmark lawsuit backed by Integrity First for America alleges that the organizers of the 2017 Unite the Rally never expected a peaceful demonstration. Rather, as the evidence will show, they spent months planning a weekend of racist anti-Semitic violence that we now know was a harbinger of the extremism plaguing our country today. I am pleased to introduce the team behind this lawsuit, uniquely taking on the leaders of the hate groups at the center of this violent movement and holding them accountable in federal court for the violence they brought in Charlottesville in 2017. We are joined tonight by IFA Director Amy Spitalnik, Lead Counsel Roberta Kaplan, Lead Counsel Karen Dunn, Attorney Michael Block, all of whom will discuss this landmark case and the fight against violent hate with Dahlia Lithwick, Senior Editor, Slate.com. IFA's case has already had enormous impacts on the violence movement, and if successful, this trial this fall, it will strike a devastating blow against the white supremacist movement and forge a legal path forward against violence and hate. As report after report underscores the urgency of combating white supremacy and violence and extremism in America, IFA's work is all very critical. Alan and I have been so inspired by the work of IFA, their innovation, their courage, their tenacity, as they fight to hold these neo-Nazis and white supremacists accountable and work to make our communities and our country safer. We have personally supported them, helping to ensure that their team stays safe during the trial. We hope that after hearing this conversation, that you too will be inspired to support their fight, our fight, the fight against hate and violence.
So let me briefly introduce you to the 5 speakers this evening. Dahlia Lithwick is Senior Editor of Slate, where she has written her Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence columns since 1999. Her work has appeared basically everywhere, including the New York Times, Harper's, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the New Republic, and Commentary. She is host of Amicus, Slate's award-winning biweekly podcast about the law and the Supreme Court. Roberta Kaplan is the founding partner at Kaplan Heckler Fink LLP and a formidable litigator with decades of experience in both commercial and civil rights litigation. She is perhaps best known for representing Edith Windsor in the landmark case in which the Supreme Court held that a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional, landing the first major victory in the battle for marriage equality. Karen Dunn is a partner at Paul Weiss and one of the nation's top trial lawyers, widely recognized for securing courtroom victories in difficult cases on behalf of the world's most prominent companies. Prior to entering private practice, Karen served in all 3 branches of government, including as Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, Associate White House Counsel under President Obama, and Senior Advisor and Communications Director to Senator Clinton. Michael Block is counsel at Kaplan Heckler Fink. He's an experienced trial lawyer who spent over 7 years as a public defender at the Bronx Defenders and 3 years as a litigation associate at Williams and Conley before joining Kaplan Heckler. Amy Spitalnik is executive director at IFA. Amy has extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including as a communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General and communications advisor and spokesman for the New York City Mayor. Amy has been named a Women in Power Fellow at the 92nd Street Y, a Truman National Security Project Fellow, a City and State 40 Under 40 Rising Star, and a Jewish Week 36 Under 36 Changemaker. Perhaps most notably, Amy and the team behind this case were recently dubbed 21st Century Nazi Hunters by The Forward. We're thrilled to have all of them with us tonight. Before we begin, we're going to show a short video that takes us back to what happened in Charlottesville 4 years ago. As you can imagine, it has some disturbing images and sounds.
Charlottesville. Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote violence. A car has rammed into a crowd.
Victims thrown in the air.
Deadly act of domestic terror.
One woman dead, others chasing women.
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
So I want to start by thanking the Hartmans, the Streicker Center, the team that has put this amazing event together. And I also want to start by telling the astonishing attorneys that you are going to meet tonight that they are and remain the Harlem Globetrotters of really, anti-hate, anti-white supremacy litigation. And it is just a profound honor to be in conversation. I also want to just tell folks to put your questions in the chat. We're going to talk amongst ourselves for about 35, 40 minutes and then try to get to as many of your questions as we can. So please, as we go along, if we're not clear, if something is fuzzy, feel free to ask your questions. And I just want to say maybe as a precatory note, and a thing that is just purely ironic is that I actually lived in Charlottesville for 18 years. So those really were my streets. But I just want to say that I know we're in a maelstrom right now, a blender of news, and there's a million things going on. And it's really easy to say, oh, this lawsuit, which is years in the making, doesn't kind of hit the top 12 things that I should be watching right now. And I just want to urge you to come to this conversation with the knowledge that what we saw in Charlottesville in 2017 was a real harbinger of what we are now seeing all around, what we saw on January 6th at the Capitol, and that these folks have thought harder about these issues of race intersecting with white supremacy and the law and power and organizing online than almost anyone I know. So while we're going to talk about Charlottesville tonight, this really, I think, inflects upon so many of the major democratic and constitutional questions we are trying to think out as a country. So with that, I want to welcome Amy and Michael and Karen and Robbie and invite folks to put questions in the chat. And Amy, let's start with you, only to locate this lawsuit in everything else. There's so much going on. And even with respect to the Charlottesville events, there have been charges against the car rammer. There's other activity happening, but nothing begins to touch, I think, what your suit is trying to do. So I wonder if you could just talk really briefly about what the suit is, what the sort of nature of what is going on trial in a few weeks, and how it's really path-breaking in a lot of ways that defy your regular criminal trial.
Absolutely. And I think, frankly, you and the Hartmans really put this in great context to start, which is that what happened in Charlottesville 4 years ago was not an isolated incident. It was a preview and a harbinger of the violence that has followed and has really metastasized and morphed and grown in so many ways. And what we saw on January 6th was the natural culmination of years of the same sort of extremism and disinformation that fueled Unite the Right. But it didn't stop there, and it doesn't stop there. We're seeing this now happening at school boards and in so many other ways around the country where extremists are not only emboldened, but they're empowered. And this violence and extremism is hitting communities around this country in a way that is really at crisis levels. And this isn't just anecdotal. We know this because the stats back it up. We know that hate crimes were at their highest ever levels in 2020 since 2001, that white supremacy is, quote, the most persistent and lethal threat to this country, according to the Department of Homeland Security under President Trump. We know that domestic extremism, domestic terror is at record levels, the highest ever since 1995, which was the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. And so every statistic illustrates what I think all of us know in our gut, that this is a crisis, that we're facing a cycle of violence in which each attack inspires the next. And that when we look back to 4 years ago, it really was that harbinger, that preview of what's followed. I think to understand the importance of the case, it's worth taking a few minutes to remember exactly what happened. First, on Friday, August 11th, when these neo-Nazis carrying tiki torches chanted things like "Jews will not replace us," and marched on the University of Virginia grounds, where they ultimately surrounded a small group of peaceful counter-protesters at the Thomas Jefferson statue, beating them up, punching them, throwing fuel and lit torches at them. One of our plaintiffs who was there that night, a Black undergraduate student, said he thought he was going to die. The violence, of course, continued throughout the weekend. The next day, on Saturday, August 12th, we know how the local synagogue in downtown Charlottesville was surrounded by violent neo-Nazis chanting things like "Sieg Heil," carrying semi-automatic weapons, talking in online chats about, quote, torching those Jewish monsters. And the synagogue had to evacuate congregants and Torah scrolls out the back. And the detail that always gets me, some of you may have even heard me share this if you've come to some of our prior events, is that the synagogue was home to a Torah scroll saved from Nazi Germany decades ago. And in America in 2017, it was once again under Nazi threat. And that, I think, crystallizes really what's at stake here, not just for Jews, but for so many communities. And of course, the violence continued, culminating in a car attack in which Heather Heyer was killed. So many of our plaintiffs were injured, as you saw in that short video. And as we're going to talk about tonight, and as this case really details, that wasn't an accident. It was meticulously planned in advance on social media chats and other forums. And again, that's not an accident. That's not a clash between opposing sides. That's a racist, violent conspiracy. We have laws that are meant to protect against it. And it's exactly those laws that our plaintiffs and our incredible legal team are using to hold those responsible accountable.
So, Robbie Kaplan, maybe you will lay out what the theory was of the case and what it is that really is so path-breaking in terms of not going after a couple of guys for being violent, but really trying, in some sense, to crack the spine of white racism in America.
So let me begin by saying, Dahlia, that if we are the Harlem Globetrotters, and thank you for the compliment, my grandfather would have been very happy about that. But if we are the Harlem Globetrotters, we are the shortest Harlem Globetrotters team that ever existed on the planet by a long shot. Look, and I'm going to tell some of this story kind of in real time about what happened, and you were a part of it, and I hope you don't mind me telling that story, Dahlia. But basically, in August 2017, when these horrible things happened in Charlottesville, I, like many people who I'm sure are watching this, was kind of watching it on the TV screen. At that point in time, the Attorney General of the United States was Jeff Sessions. I think it's fair to say, without sounding partisan, that Jeff Sessions did not have a very good record when it comes to civil rights. And so I was very concerned that what was clear to me, and I think clear to most people in watching it, that this wasn't just a kind of chaotic riot. It wasn't just a happenstance occurrence. It was a deliberately planned violent event, that wouldn't be taken care of by the government the way, frankly, it should. And so I started to think about what to do. My law firm was really in its infancy then, but what to do. And one of the first two people I called are on this screen tonight, Karen Dunn and Dahlia. And I called you because I knew you were in Charlottesville. I normally call you for legal advice, but I was actually calling you for fact advice to say, what do you think? And you basically said, you're thinking the right thing. Something needs to happen here. The DOJ may not do it, probably won't do it. Come on down to Charlottesville. I'll introduce you to a bunch of people. In that first week, I think it was only a week or so after it happened, it's a trip I'll never forget. The town was very, very much still in a state of shock. The white kind of two-story vans, Mercedes vans, believe it or not, that the white supremacists used to drive around Charlottesville and to come into Charlottesville during these events were still driving around the city streets. People were terrified. We met with a whole bunch of people. Some of them either became our plaintiffs right then or introduced us to people who became the plaintiffs in the case. And it immediately occurred to me that something needed to be done. And rather than a case from the plaintiff's perspective against maybe the police for not doing enough, or against UVA for kind of being asleep at the switch perhaps on Friday night, it seemed to me that the real case that needed to get filed was against the people who actually did it. And not just the soldiers, the people who actually organized it, the people who caused all these men, and the vast majority of them were men, to descend upon Charlottesville from all over the country, bringing weapons and shields and uniforms, and you have it, in order to commit violence against Jews, Black people, other minorities, and their supporters. And ironically enough, I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing, but there wasn't a lot of law to look at, because the civil rights statutes that this country has, most of which were enacted right after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period, what they do is they prohibit certain kinds of governmental conduct. The government can't, in various respects, discriminate against various minorities under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. There are very few civil rights laws in our country that apply to private conduct. And one of those laws, which is having a renaissance today, sadly enough, is the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which sounds exactly what it is. It was a law passed by Congress, Reconstructionist Congress, to try to stop the growing rise of the KKK in the Deep South during Reconstruction. And because the members of the KKK, who at that time were meeting in forests in white robes and hoods, were private citizens, this law that we're using is directed against private citizens. And what it basically says is private citizens cannot organize together in a conspiracy for the purpose of committing racialized violence. Ironically, it is intended to implement the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which is the amendment that prohibits slavery. And it basically says, theoretically, you can't re-enslave people by having these kind of events then that the KKK was doing. Later in our history, it was used in the 1920s. It was used in a couple of civil rights cases about people who'd come down from the North during Freedom Summer and were killed. There are a couple cases there. It hasn't been used that much successfully, but sadly, in August 2017, what happened in Charlottesville, in your hometown, Dahlia, was the epitome of what is prohibited by the KKK Act, and that's what we sued under.
And Karen, I guess I want to turn to you to ask both the nagging lawyerly question that I persistently nag you with, which is, but it's just speech, right? This is just protected free speech. These are a bunch of people. It was a protest. It's essential First Amendment activity, right? It's a political protest in the public square. And I'm not going to belabor this, but certainly I think there is some valence of all this that suggests that you're going after people because you don't like what they said. And I guess I'd ask you to respond to that. And maybe also, as we come up against, you all are deep in trial prep, I guess I'm curious how much of that you're hearing now.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thanks so much for having us. I have to say that as we get closer and closer to trial, the support from people is so meaningful. It's hard to even describe. Before I answer Dahlia's question, today I had to go to my doctor's office and pick something up. And the woman who is his assistant, handed me this thing I have to pick up. And she said to me, good luck. We're all thinking about you, which just moved me so much. People who know that we're doing this, and all of you have been so supportive and so incredibly heartening as we spend each and every day going through evidence that is filled with so much hate and so much vitriol and so much violence that it's really refreshing to interact with people who are loving and kind. So to answer Dahlia's question is I think also, before I became a private practice lawyer, I was a government lawyer. And I worked on our cases in the Western District of Virginia. This case, I was a prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia. And I worked on cases that are sort of early precursors to a case like this, where we actually looked at RICO theories to pursue white supremacists. We might not have called them white supremacists at the time, but very, very similar. And those cases ended up creating very good law in the Fourth Circuit, similar to law elsewhere, which says doing violence and talking about committing violence and committing violence is not protected First Amendment speech. And so Dahlia, of course, on all things law is always correct. And the defendants in this case did try to bring these arguments. We expect we'll hear some of them at trial, where they said, our conduct was protected speech. The case that we brought very purposefully is not at all about speech. It's entirely about action and about planning, executing, and ratifying violence. And so our case is not, in our view, which I think has been validated by the court, it's not even really a close call that this is about speech. It's like, if I talk to Robbie about robbing a bank and then we go rob the bank, which we do all the time, Robbie and I are not engaged in protected speech. We have instead planned to rob a bank, which we then did, and we need to be held accountable for that. And that's what this case is about.
Mike, I want to turn to you also to ask, I have these unfortunate 4-part Stephen Breyer type questions, and I always regret asking multi-layered questions, but I do have a 2-part question for you as well that may coalesce into one as we bump along. But first of all, I guess I'm just curious how you drew a line between all the work you've done preparing for this trial and what you saw on January 6th. And whether you had the reaction I had to January 6th, which, by the way, my teenage sons had to January 6th, which is, here we go again. It looked so profoundly familiar. And to the extent that there are themes that shoot through your trial prep, what you can tell us about how they're connected, and maybe buried in that is the coda question, which is so much of the response to January 6th is the kind of nihilism, people defending themselves pro se, flooding the court with nonsense motions, refusing to turn over discovery. I mean, there just feels like this isn't a fair fight because your team is following the rules and there is another team that just thinks that the rule of law is hilarious. So whether that's one question or two, I guess I'd love you to take a whack at just, what do we do with the nihilism of both these events? And how does law become an ordering force against people who don't believe in law as an ordering force?
Sure, thanks. And I want to echo what everybody said. Thank you all for your support and for being here. And also thank you, Dahlia. I dreamed as a child of one day being on the Harlem Globetrotters, and this is surely the closest I will ever get. In terms of the comparison between Charlottesville and January 6th, there certainly are ideological themes that run from Charlottesville through January 6th. And I think the two sort of overarching themes that I notice are one, this idea that this country is being stolen from us, and us at Charlottesville for sure is white people. And so this idea, and you see it in the chants that played out in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us. It all stems from this theory known as replacement theory that the Jews are the puppet masters that are sort of gathering, sort of pulling the strings to get white people replaced as a dominant force in this country. And so I think, and those themes, I think, were very much echoed on January 6th, this idea that the election was stolen and that the system isn't fair, and that the way to deal with that is rioting and violence. And so I think they are very much of a piece. And I think the second part of your question in terms of how law can play a role, I mean, you're absolutely right that for this trial has gone on for 4 years now because, frankly, the defendants in our case don't want to play by the rules and don't want to follow court orders. And shortly after we served our discovery requests, all of a sudden phones fell in the toilet and disappeared, and social media accounts were deleted, and there was all sorts of shenanigans relating to the collection of evidence. And I think one thing that has been heartening for me, and I think for the team, is that we have fought that every step of the way, and I think have been successful in not only recovering sort of what's left, but also in gaining at least some measure of accountability already in the form of major sanctions that we've won against defendants and defendant groups, that I think in a very real sense, defendants in our case did not, by and large, play by the rules. But I think the legal system has so far accounted for it.
I love that answer, Michael, because it's such a good segue into the question I want to ask Amy. And I also want to remind folks, we're going to start taking your questions in about 15 minutes. So please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. But Amy, I feel like I also have heard you say so many times, and I think this is important, we're not actually drowning under the nihilism. We're not drowning under, having to read the stuff, just even reading the Discord chats that you all, wade through, not to mention, the threats you still get, could be really deeply destabilizing. And yet I think that you have said more than once, no, we're actually taking it to white supremacy. This is actually impacting, Mike sort of flicked at, there are real costs to these defendants. But I think that you would go further and say there has been a real cost to white supremacy. And I'm guessing there are, 704 people in this Zoom who are like, well, that can't be right because it's really bad and the numbers are horrible. So help us understand the connection between what Michael just said, no, actually, they have not fared well in the intervening 4 years, and the ways in which what you are doing and plan to do at trial really does, I think, cut to the heart of white supremacy and racism.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That what Mike said, that the rule of law has worked in many ways, in that every time these defendants have tried every trick in the book to avoid accountability. And to your point, it's not just flouting court orders, refusing to turn over phones. It's using threats of violence against our team to try to intimidate us away from holding them accountable. It's why security is the biggest expense for us in this case, frankly. They use every possible trick to try to intimidate us and to shut this down and to avoid the accountability. And we just simply haven't let them. And that gives me a lot of hope, because it shows that you can use the justice system to actually hold people accountable. The reason white supremacy has metastasized and grown in recent years is because there really has been a stunning lack of accountability more broadly. Not just out of Charlottesville, as you alluded to earlier, there were a handful of criminal prosecutions. This case is really the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of that conspiracy. And unsurprisingly, people who also really make up the broad leadership of this movement in many ways. People like Richard Spencer, Andrew Anglin of the Daily Stormer, the National Socialist Movement, which is one of the largest neo-Nazi groups, League of the South, many others. And what we've seen in this case is that when you actually hold these extremists accountable for their actions, you can have a very real impact on them. So Richard Spencer called this case financially crippling. Defendants have talked about how this has bankrupted their organizations already, made it impossible for them to go about their business, prevented them from opening new buildings. Some have cited this case and saying that they didn't want to return to Charlottesville in 2018 because they didn't want to be sued again. And a variety of other consequences that they face. And some of these defendants have already been marginalized and bankrupt in this movement. Richard Spencer is perhaps one of the best examples of that. The most prominent neo-Nazi in the country a few years ago has now been, again, to quote him, financially crippled by this lawsuit. And so I think what we hope comes out of this is, of course, not just the accountability that has been so lacking, the justice for our plaintiffs, the ability to bankrupt and dismantle these groups and these leaders through large financial judgments, but also a reminder that accountability matters and it works, and that there will be consequences for this sort of behavior if you participate in it. And that if there actually is accountability, like there is in this case, it can have very real impacts. And we just need to do that at scale and ensure that those who are participating in this sort of extremism are finally being held accountable on a variety of levels. It doesn't stop and start with civil litigation like this. But civil litigation can have a huge impact, especially when it's part of not just a whole of government, but a whole of society approach to taking on white supremacy and extremism that also holds social media companies to account, that involves local, state, and federal action, that involves de-radicalization and education work. But going after their finances, going after their operations through civil litigation like this works, and it matters. And so that's what I think we've been really heartened to see thus far, and certainly eager to see play out come trial in just a few weeks.
Robbie and Karen, can you talk a little bit about what you're going to do? Give us a little TikTok of what the trial's going to look like, who your witnesses are, how you're preparing. I think folks probably this seems like you are going to try to move a mountain in the coming weeks. And I wonder if you could break it down a little. Karen, do you want to go first?
Go ahead, Karen.
Sure. I mean, I am watching the questions in the chat, and I think it's a great question you asked, Dahlia, because I feel like we might be assuming knowledge that some people have and other people don't. So just to go to the basics a little bit, our plaintiffs are people who were injured both during the Torch March, where a group of peaceful protesters, very few of them, maybe 25, locked arms around the Thomas Jefferson statue and were encircled 10 deep by individuals chanting, hurling racial epithets, throwing substances like lighter fluid, and wielding lit torches, which were occasionally thrown at the peaceful protesters. And plaintiffs who were injured on Saturday, August 12th, in the car attack, which cost Heather Heyer her life and injured many other people, including some of our plaintiffs. The defendants in the case are people who contributed to the planning or the execution of these violent events. Some of them are people whose full-time job were organizing the events. Some of them are leaders of the groups who came and led the events. We also have sued the groups. And some of them are people who were active in the conspiracy in the form of committing the violence. So that's just kind of brass tacks. As far as moving a mountain, yes, that is what we are doing. There are a lot of defendants and plaintiffs in this case. There is an incredible amount of evidence in this case. And so the amount of work that it's going to take to bring it to trial that it has taken is really tremendous and we want to make sure that we credit the teams who have been working very hard on this, very hard, pouring their blood, sweat, and tears into it. And so our plan is, very simply, to be honest, there's some cases where the facts are the facts and they're your best trial themes are the actual facts of what happened. And that is this case. We are going to tell the story of what happened. And this will be the first time that anybody has really heard the full story about what happened in Charlottesville on those days and about the planning for those days. We have evidence that nobody has seen publicly before, and we're going to show it to the jury in this case. We're just going to tell them what happened. The defendants are going to testify, and they're an important part of telling the story about what they did, and our plaintiffs are going to testify. And it's very hard with some of our plaintiffs to find anybody who could listen to their story and not be moved to tears. And so, they're doing the brave work here, more so than we are really. They're doing the brave work of coming to trial and retelling stories that are going to live with them and haunt them for the rest of their lives.
Robbie, can you amplify a little bit what it's going to be like, to try to draw these stories out of your plaintiffs, to try to get your defendants to be truthful and respectful in a context that could really, really slide into circus very quickly?
Yeah. So in terms of what it's going to be like, I have a bit of a sense right now. I think we all do because we've really been preparing day and night to get ready. And I've gone back. We all have gone back through what these defendants said over and over again and how they say it. And if people thought the video that began this introduction was disturbing, that's nothing, I have to say, compared to the videos and the texts and the chats that we are going to show in this trial, not just from the defendant's mouths live, and that we can talk about that in a second, but from videos that they took of themselves, from chats they had, from emails and texts and Facebook posts. And it's some tough stuff. I mean, I've been a lawyer for a long time now. I thought I had thick skin. I think I have thick skin. But even for me, this stuff is hard to go through, and it's going to be tough, I think, for the jury. I think the jury is going to be very moved by it, but it's not going to be an easy process. On top of that, we're going to have people explain it to the jury. So we have an expert on white supremacy, Pete Simi, who's going to explain how the tactics that were used by these guys were classic tactics of white supremacy and kind of explain that to the jury. We're going to have the eminent, I think that's probably an understatement, Holocaust historian Deborah Lipstadt, who's going to answer this question, which every time I listen to the evidence occurs to me, and I know the answer, which is why the Jews? When you listen to these guys talk, and I'm not exaggerating, 85 to 90% of their vitriol is anti-Semitism. Most of these guys don't live in areas where there are a whole lot of Jews. So I think an obvious question that the jury is going to have, anyone listening to it's going to have, is why is there such pervasive anti-Semitism in these guys and how they talk about it? Michael explained it a little bit earlier with replacement theory, but we're going to have Deborah Lipstadt do the same thing at trial. We're also going to have witnesses, for example, some of whom have never testified before, like a former girlfriend of one of the key advisors and key organizers and defendants here, who was at key meetings in which the defendants talked about what they wanted to do and celebrated what they had done. So the jury will hear all of that. In terms of the trial itself, we have the problem not only of defendants, including at least one defendant who's in prison, who's being moved right now as we speak to Charlottesville to attend trial in prison for issuing violent threats against others. But we have COVID too. So this is going to be kind of unique in a whole bunch of respects. The court has already issued orders having COVID protocols for who can go into the courtroom and how things will be. There's going to have to be security, obviously, assuming that there are a lot of kind of protesters on either side outside. I'm hoping that won't be a problem. But it's going to be a tricky job. It's a big job for the judge and his staff and his clerks. I think they're well aware of that, and they're busy preparing for it. And I think the judge here will take control of the courtroom. He will not let the kind of antics that we saw in terms of discovery happen in the courtroom. And if any of the defendants try to obstruct the presentation of the evidence, I don't think that will last very long.
And Mike, I want to turn to you with the question I always hate asking most, even more than the First Amendment question that I asked Karen. But this is just the question about, you're not just running a trial, you are also targets. All of you, every single person that I am looking at on this screen has been the recipient of unbelievable, I can't begin to express what you have received. And I guess the question I want to ask is, how much does that affect how you do this trial? Because you're not just cross-examining witnesses, you're cross-examining witnesses who have very, very much put targets on all of your backs for the last 4 years. And I'm saying that as delicately as I can. You can amplify or not. But you're part of this story in a really essential way, which is that these folks have come after you. And I'm not even sure what the question is, other than where you put that in your brain as you, who otherwise would be just preparing for a trial, are also preparing for a really large public referendum on Jews and civility and the rule of law.
Yeah, I think I think of three things, Dahlia. One is we have a phenomenal security team that is working around the clock, that will be there in Charlottesville, that has been with us since day one and has really monitored what's gone on and made us feel as safe as we can. Two, I think it's just critically important that, you know, our job is to find evidence and cross-examine witnesses and put it together. And you just have to stay focused on that and try to sort of shut out the noise. And there's a lot of noise in this case, but I think you just have to sort of stay focused on, on our job, which is to gather evidence and to put it together in the most compelling way for the jury. And the third thing is I always remember that what the legal team and Amy have dealt with in terms of, threats and online threats, et cetera, are nothing compared to what our plaintiffs went through on August 11th and 12th, where they went out there to Charlottesville and stood up and actually faced down 500 white supremacists with tiki torches, and then went back on Saturday and peacefully protested through the streets and really stood up against hate. And then after what happened to them, which was obviously extraordinarily traumatizing for them and for the community of Charlottesville, decided that they were going to continue with this process and stand up and go through this case and sit for depositions and come into court and tell their story and be cross-examined by the very people who hurt them. And they have faced, obviously, in addition to all of that, threats as well. And so it's just, we are privileged to represent a extraordinarily courageous group of Virginia residents with an extraordinary team with us and behind us. And we just sort of take that and stay focused and go to court and do our job.
If I can add one bit of context to what Mike said, and everything he said is, of course, exactly right. And I think the bravest people here are not only survived what they went through, but also were harassed and threatened themselves in the aftermath of surviving it, which is one of the reasons security has been so important. I want to note that the legal work in this case is being donated up until like $40 million is probably our current estimate of what the legal work in this case would cost if it were being billed. And that is an extraordinary number. The costs in this case, by far the biggest line item in IFA's budget is security because of these threats against the plaintiffs, threats against our team directly from the defendants who have threatened people like Robbie or me or others on the team, threats from other white supremacists who are looking on at what these defendants are saying about us and are taking it as inspiration to act, some of which law enforcement has had to respond to. But in many cases, these extremists are quite smart and know how to walk the line so that their online threats aren't actionable, but are really just seen as calls to action for threats and harassment by their followers. And so, again, the biggest line item in our budget is security for that reason, which is unique to suing neo-Nazis. It's certainly not something that exists in most normal civil litigation. But I hope folks know that, if you do support this effort, if you support IFA, it is directly supporting our security costs at this point. And so it is something, when Karen and others are talking about how it's so meaningful to be in a room virtually of supporters, it's also deeply personal when you support this effort because it's ensuring that our team can litigate this case and win this case at trial safely and focus on winning without worrying about their safety or our plaintiff's safety.
And Amy, before we turn to the questions from the audience, which are phenomenal, and I am grateful for the engagement, nobody is zoomed out on this call. So that's incredibly inspiring after a year and a half. But can you just describe, I think an awful lot of folks are just saying, how can I help? How can I engage? How can I watch? What can I do? And I just think to the extent that you can give just very nuts and bolts answers to folks who want to support you, want to be a part of this, want to bear witness, what can you tell them?
Yeah, I'll say two things that you can do. First and foremost, if you have the ability, please consider making a donation to IFA. We are a nonpartisan 501c3. And again, every single donation directly is supporting security costs at this point, which is by far our biggest expense. IntegrityFirstForAmerica.org. You can go right there, donate. We have a gap to close. We have about $1 million left to raise to make sure security is funded. And so please know it is deeply personal. It's deeply personal to us when all of you support this because it keeps our team safe and allows us to win as opposed to being worried about our safety. It allows this incredible legal team and our plaintiffs to do what they need to do instead of worrying about the extremists who are actively mobilizing people to show up in Charlottesville. Some of our defendants are actively calling on their supporters to show up. So that is number one. Number two is sign up for updates. And I believe our team has put a link in the chat where you can directly sign up for case updates. And we will make sure that you are getting near daily updates throughout trial about what's happening. Who has testified? What is the evidence that came out in court today? The other details to ensure that we know many of you are not going to be able to be in Charlottesville, and because of COVID and security restrictions, you can't necessarily be in court in Charlottesville with all of us physically, but we know you're there with us sort of in spirit, and we want to make sure that you are all kept apprised of what's happening. So we will be sending out those updates from IFA. If you sign up at the link that's in the chat, you can also just go to IntegrityFirstForAmerica.org. And to that point, please also spread the word. Whether it's sharing the recording of this event, sharing the link to our website, let people know that this trial is happening starting on October 25th, that there's a concrete, tangible way to take action against these extremists and hold them accountable. And they could do so by getting involved with IFA as well. So IntegrityFirstForAmerica.org, your one-stop shop, donate, sign up for updates. We promise to keep you closely apprised of what's happening when this incredible team heads to court on October 25th.
And Karen, if you would just briefly answer the question that I think you answered in the chat, but folks want to know why it's not being live streamed, why they can't watch it gavel to gavel. why is the arrangement such that pretty much the most we're going to get is these updates?
So this case is being tried in federal court. And one really neat thing about federal court in some respects, although some would disagree with this, is that there are no cameras in the courtroom. So any trial you've watched on TV does not happen in federal court. But the court does need to make some provision for public access, because public access to the court is very important. And in an era of COVID, that is always a challenge. So our understanding so far, although if you sign up for Amy's updates, I'm sure she'll let you know, is that there's going to be a public line, a public phone line where people can listen to what's happening in the courtroom. And just to be honest, I tried a case earlier this year where it was the same arrangement where the public could call in and listen, and people really loved it. I think the public phone line, which is a COVID innovation for courts, actually gives many, many, many more people access to what's going on in these cases than anyone would ever have before, because most people are not going to come to court every day and watch a trial. So I actually think it's really fantastic. And I got great feedback from my last trial from random people all over the place who just dialed in. So I think you should be able to do that here.
And Mike, can you answer the question that is, again, popping up an awful lot in the chat about who is representing the white supremacists? Do they have lawyers? Are their lawyers respectable people who are going to conduct themselves fairly? What's the plan for folks who are acting pro se, that is to say, representing themselves? What's the defense, whatever the other Harlem Globetrotters or whatever they may be? What does that look like?
Yeah, so there are a group of defendants that are represented. There are about 5 attorneys who represent about, I would say, 7 of the defendants. Some of them share their clients' ideological leanings, although I don't anticipate any antics from the lawyers. They are they comport themselves appropriately. There are a handful of defendants who are unrepresented, as you say. And, we've been dealing with them throughout the case. It has certainly been an interesting experience from a litigation perspective. And I think it remains to be seen how they will behave themselves in court. They have the right to participate in the trial just like anybody else, and including cross-examining witnesses. And, and that, I think that is certainly something that we need to and are preparing for and preparing witnesses for, to be cross-examined by folks that aren't necessarily going to play by the rules or have the same kind of sense of decorum. So I think that's one of the interesting X factors in this trial is how will the litigation actually go in terms of the pro se defendants and how to respond to that. So, but it's a mix of pro se defendants and represented ones.
On a somewhat lighter note, correct me if I got it wrong, Michael Chairman, but I don't think I did. Under Virginia practice, when they testify, they actually have to ask themselves questions and then answer the questions they just asked. So I've never seen that before. It's certainly going to be interesting, to say the least.
One of my questions about this trial is whether the judge is going to enforce that.
Great question.
I'm willing to bet 5 shekels that.
Robbie, would you take the question? Different iterations of this are also popping up in the chat, but can you again connect? I asked Mike to connect it to January 6th. Folks want to see if you draw a line between the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting, and if you draw a line between some of the, really violent anti-masking protests that have arisen in recent months. Is there a through line here that, again, speaks to sort of a larger polarization, willingness to turn to violence, othering going on?
Sadly, there absolutely is. one of the things that's so distinctive about Charlottesville, and Charlottesville was really the first, at least, time that I think so many of us became publicly aware of this, is that if we go back to the KKK Act of 1871, the people that they were trying to combat with that new law were people who were meeting in forests in their local communities, in robes and in hoods, to try to keep themselves secret from the wider population, or at least law authority that was not sympathetic to them. Today, you don't need a hood or a white robe. All you need is a name for yourself on Facebook or Discord or Twitter or other various Gab, other chats that really don't have very many controls. And that has enabled these groups and these people to organize, not just throughout the United States of America. We saw that in Charlottesville. Many of these people, most of our defendants are not local. They come from all over the country. But it is that has continued at an even heightened pitch. So the Tree of Life Synagogue, and Amy is the absolute expert on the connections here. But the guy who shot so many people tragically in Pittsburgh was in communication with defendants in our case, was inspired by these chat rooms and by these symbols that they used. That's true not only for Pittsburgh, but for Christ Church and for others. And this desire, this, as you put it, Dahlia, this sense of the other, this polarization, which when people talk to each other in person is harder to do. Online and perhaps even exacerbated by COVID has become so horrible. And when you read and see what these guys say, unfortunately, it's only continued. And so I'm hoping that one thing that comes out of this trial, it's my I think most sincere hope here, is that I can't stop. None of us can stop under the First Amendment what these people say to each other, and they will always have electronic means, unfortunately, of communicating. It's a bit of a whack-a-mole. They just go from company to company to company in terms of to communicate with each other. But what I want to say to them is, it's one thing to have those hateful beliefs. If you think you can organize a violent conflagration to create a white ethno-state on the streets of American City ever again, this is what's going to happen to you. Hopefully you'll be put in jail, but no matter what, at least this is going to happen to you. And we will get huge judgments. We will put you on trial, and then we will follow you with those judgments for the rest of your lives, if need be, in order to collect the money that our plaintiffs truly deserve to get back for what happened to them.
And Amy, maybe I'll give you the last word, although I want to stipulate I would stay on this Zoom for another 17 hours if I could. But I think that there's an awful lot of people. I think Leslie gives voice to this. There's just a bunch of groups, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ADL, the ACLU. I mean, there's a lot of groups doing anti-racism, doing anti-violence work. Can you both locate what you're doing in the context of this? I think there's a lot of groups doing phenomenal work. And maybe also just to stick the landing here, I think people are asking whether there is some unified message that all of these groups are putting out there, that this isn't seriatim efforts to bat away racism here and there, but that there is really some kind of unified, larger theory of how all of the groups in America that are dealing with racial violence, with anti-Semitism, with white supremacy are coming together in some way.
Absolutely. And I'll say, and I think that's an important question, because clearly this country did not treat the crisis of extremism with the urgency it deserves. There are many experts, brilliant experts, including at some of the places you mentioned, who have been ringing the alarm bells for years. Many of us even felt like we were sort of screaming into a wall or into a forest for a very long time, because it was very clear early on that the violence at Unite the Right was, again, really a preview of what followed. And we've seen that over and over again with the connections between attacks, in which each inspires the next, in which there's a clear pattern of how these groups and leaders operate. And even as the movement has evolved and become more emboldened and empowered in some ways and more mainstreamed in many ways, there's still a very clear pattern of how they operate. And so this is important because it really is the only legal effort to hold accountable the leaders of that sort of racist, violent conspiracy. And it complements the work that so many of these other groups are doing. And that is why groups like the ADL and the SPLC have been not only publicly supportive of this case, but have actually invested financially in IFA, which is extraordinary, and we are grateful. And it's a testament to the fact that this really is the only game in town when it comes to this specific legal strategy. So this is the specific niche, the specific role that we can fill in the broader fight against extremism is taking these extremists to court, making clear the consequences for this violence, and bankrupting and dismantling them through the large judgments we hope and intend to win at trial this fall. It complements so much of the other work that those groups are doing, from the research, from the de-radicalization and education, from the policy advocacy, from holding social media companies to account. And all of that is also crucial and required if we're going to actually break the cycle of extremism. But what has been sorely lacking in recent years is accountability. That is what this case is about. And we are already seeing it in this case with the impacts on the defendants. And certainly we'll see it in just a few weeks when we go to trial and finally, once and for all, bring these extremists to justice. And so I really think it is deeply complementary to this broader realm of anti-extremism work. We're so proud to partner with many of these organizations and groups. In fact, last week we had a Unite Against Nazis virtual event where all of these groups came together in support of our case. And so it's heartening to have that support. We are so thrilled to be supporting this case because of how important and how unique it is in this fight, and just really grateful to everyone who has invested in this financially, emotionally, and so many other ways over the last 4 years to help get us to the finish line, which is finally so close here.
Before I say goodnight, I just want to say again, on a personal note, that if you've never been to Charlottesville, Virginia, I tell people it is a town with one synagogue and 2 escalators. That's it. There's 2 escalators in Charlottesville. It is a tiny, tiny little town that is still bruised and grieving. And, you know, as a personal matter, I want to thank the Harlem Globetrotters that you see before you. I also want to thank the Streicker Center. I want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, the Hartmans who you met at the beginning. And I really, really want to thank all of you. As we said, there is a lot to carry in the world right now, and taking on an hour to talk about really brutal ugly racism is not as fun as Netflix. So all of the information in the chat on how to support IFA and how to support these extraordinary lawyers is there. And I really want to say that I, as a legal reporter, think this is going to be a singular landmark legal moment. And I really implore you, as Amy said, to spread the word. So I want to thank Amy, Michael, Robbie, and Karen, and all of you for joining. And I want to wish these amazing, amazing people best of luck in the coming weeks. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.